Welcome to The Debate. It is January 2026, and, if you're paying attention to the American legal landscape, you might be tempted to pop the champagne. The Supreme Court has spent the last, 18 months fortifying the First Amendment into an absolute fortress, handing down rulings that strictly limit the government's ability to interfere with speech. On paper, liberty has never looked better.
And yet, if you close the law books and open a browser, or walk onto a university campus, or just talk to your neighbors, the vibe isn't liberty, it's anxiety. We're living through this really strange paradox where the law says we are freer than ever, but the culture demands silence.
That is exactly the tension we're dissecting today. We're looking at that friction between the parchment and the pavement. So the central question is this: is the state of free speech in America actually healthy because our legal guardrails are successfully checking state power? Or has the fear of social retaliation, the chilling effect, rendered those protections irrelevant for the average citizen?
It's the difference between having a shield and actually feeling safe enough to drop your guard. My position is that we're looking at the wrong metrics. While you, the advocate, are focused on these courtroom victories, I'm looking at the psychological reality. The practical reality of 2026 is that a pervasive fear of social and professional ruin is silencing discourse just as effectively as any government censor could. We're in a crisis of liberty, regardless of what the Supreme Court says.
And I take the opposing view. I would argue that the First Amendment is functioning exactly as it was designed, to restrain the state, not to make you comfortable at a dinner party. What you're calling a crisis is actually the robust, messy sound of a free society holding itself accountable. The system is working precisely because the government is being kept in its box. The social friction we feel, well, that's just the heat generated by a free marketplace of ideas.
That heat is burning the marketplace down, but I'm sure we'll get to that.
We certainly will. But I want to start with the structural argument. To understand why I say the system is healthy, we have to go back to first principles and really define what the First Amendment is. It's what legal scholars call a negative right.
We should probably break that down. Negative right sounds like a bad thing to the uninitiated.
Fair point. Let's do and explain like I'm 5. A positive right is when the government is obligated to give you something, like the right to an attorney. The government has to provide it. A negative right is a restraint. It tells the government what it cannot do. The First Amendment says, Congress shall make no law. It's a leash on the government dog. It does not say your neighbor must listen to you, or Twitter or X must publish you, or your boss can't fire you for being rude.
Right. It restricts the sovereign, not the citizen.
Exactly. And in 2026, we're seeing this massive conflation of censorship with consequence. If I say something controversial, and you, as a private citizen, decide to boycott my business or fire me from your private company, well, that is your First Amendment right in action. You are expressing your disapproval. If we try to use the law to stop you from reacting to me, we're actually infringing on your speech.
And look, that is the classic libertarian defense. And structurally, you're correct. But it ignores the scale. We aren't talking about one neighbor ignoring another. We're talking about systemic, synchronized social punishment.
Punishment or accountability?
That depends on who's holding the pitchfork. But let's look at the psychology of the American voter in 2026. We have the comprehensive survey data released by the Pew Research Center in late 2025. It showed that 65% of Americans reported being afraid to speak their true political opinions due to potential social or professional consequences. That is nearly 2/3 of the country self-censoring.
But fear of criticism is not the same as suppression, though.
It is when the penalty is loss of livelihood that 65% aren't afraid of being debated. They're afraid of being unemployable. They're afraid of the digital scarlet letter. When the cost of speaking is that high, the marketplace of ideas just collapses because the vendors are too scared to open their stalls.
But let me push back on that for a second. You're framing this 65% statistic as a failure of liberty. I would frame it as a success of conscience. If people are hesitating to speak, is it possible that they're simply considering the impact of their words more carefully? Historically, marginalized groups had no voice to push back against powerful entities or offensive speech. Now, through social media and collective action, what you call cancel culture, They have a mechanism to impose social costs on bad behavior. That isn't a chilling effect. That is quality control.
Quality control implies a rational process, like a factory inspector checking a widget. What we're seeing is often closer to a mob dynamic. And I want to look specifically at the educational environment in 2026 to illustrate this. We aren't just talking about people being polite. We're talking about the heckler's veto.
Right. That's another term we should probably define clearly.
Sure. The heckler's veto is a legal concept where the government shuts down a speaker because the crowd's reaction, the heckling, is becoming violent or disruptive. Essentially, the heckler gets to veto the speech by causing a scene.
Right. And courts have consistently ruled that the government cannot enforce a heckler's veto. The police are supposed to protect the speaker, not shut them up. In theory.
But on campuses in 2026, we are seeing a cultural version of this. We have record support among university students for disruptive tactics to prevent controversial speakers from being heard at all. This isn't counter speech. If I shout so loud or pull the fire alarm or block the entrance so that no one can hear you, I'm not debating you. I am physically preventing the exchange of ideas.
But disruption can be a form of protest.
There's a line between protest and obstruction. When the prevailing norm on campus, the supposed nursery of liberty, is that dangerous ideas should be physically or socially prevented from being aired, that is not accountability. That is safetyism. It threatens the intellectual foundation of society if we decide that emotional safety trumps inquiry.
I'm not convinced that safetyism is the dominant force you claim it is. If students cross into physical obstruction, that's conduct, not speech, and universities can, and they do, punish it. But let's be honest, most of what gets labeled cancellation is simply severe criticism. And here's where I struggle with your position. You seem to want the benefits of free speech without the rough and tumble of the reaction. You want the right to speak without the risk of being yelled at.
I want a culture that values the attempt at dialogue rather than one that treats every disagreement as an act of war. When you have 65% of Democrats viewing social callouts as accountability and 62% of Republicans viewing them as unjust persecution, you have two different realities. You don't have a dialogue, you have trench warfare. And in that environment, the moderate, nuanced voices, the ones who might actually bridge that gap, are the first ones to go silent because they don't want to get shot at by both sides.
But you can't legislate culture, and that is why I keep coming back to the law. The law is the only objective standard we have. You can lament the culture all day, but the legal reality is what keeps us from sliding into actual tyranny. And on that front, the news is incredibly good.
Is it, or is it just cleaning up the mess too late?
No, it's structural. Let's talk about the NRA v. Vulo reaffirmation this year, because I think people miss the mechanics of why this is so huge.
Okay, walk us through it.
Okay, so the backstory. This started a few years ago with the New York Department of Financial Services. The head of that department didn't pass a law banning the NRA. Instead, she went to the banks and insurance companies, private companies that depend on the state for their licenses, and essentially said, "Nice banking license you have there. It would be a shame if you faced a lot of regulatory heat because you do business with the NRA."
It's the mob boss tactic, coercion by proxy.
Exactly. It's called jawboning, using informal pressure to force a private company to censor someone the government doesn't like. In 2026, the Supreme Court has not only reaffirmed their earlier ruling, but expanded it. They made it crystal clear that government officials cannot use these wink and nod threats to outsource censorship. That cuts the head off the snake. It means the government cannot use banks or tech platforms that they're hitmen.
I agree that Vulo is a vital ruling. It prevents the government from doing through the back door what it can't do through the front door. But look at the other side of the ledger. While the court is stopping coercion, it's simultaneously allowing new forms of digital friction. I'm talking about Free Speech Coalition versus Paxton, the 2025 decision regarding age verification.
That was a ruling on protecting minors from explicit content. It's a pretty narrow exception.
In theory, it's narrow. In practice, it forced the implementation of digital identification systems for accessing vast swaths of the internet. The court upheld the Texas law requiring users to verify their age, and by extension their identity, to access harmful content.
To protect children. I think most listeners would agree that's a valid state interest.
But the mechanism matters. To prove you are an adult, you have to show your papers. This introduces a concept called prior restraint in a technological sense.
Explain that.
Prior restraint is usually when the government stops you from publishing something before you even get it out there. This is a digital version. It's a turnstile. If you have to scan your digital ID to access constitutionally protected, albeit controversial material, you're gonna hesitate. You know you're on a list. You know there's a record. The Federalist Papers were written anonymously. Anonymity is a shield for the vulnerable. Paxton chips away at that shield.
But the court was very careful to balance that, and this is where the No Political Enemies Act comes in as a counterbalance. You're ignoring the legislative win here. That act, passed late last year, explicitly allows for fee recovery and damages if the government uses that data to target you for political reasons.
That act is well-intentioned, I'll grant you.
It's more than well-intentioned. It's a weapon for the citizen. We're literally making it expensive for the government to violate your rights. If a bureaucrat uses that age verification data to investigate you because you're a dissident, they are personally liable and the agency pays triple damages. That is a massive disincentive for state abuse.
But you're relying on a wait and sue model of liberty. That is my fundamental problem with your argument. You say, the system works because if the government abuses your data, you can sue them 3 years later. Most people do not have the stomach, the wallet, or the time for federal litigation. The fear of the surveillance does the work before the law ever gets involved.
So what's the alternative? Total unregulated anonymity where no laws apply?
No, but we have to acknowledge that Paxton legitimized the digital turnstile. It normalized the idea that the government has a right to know who is reading what. That's a dangerous precedent in 2026, especially when we pivot to our third topic, the new frontier of technology and norms.
You mean the AI question?
I do. We're sitting here debating human reactions and court cases, but the primary driver of speech in 2026 is algorithmic. We're dealing with AI-generated content and deep fakes moving at the speed of light.
It is a complex regulatory issue, I grant you. But how does that refute the health of the First Amendment?
Because the First Amendment assumes a marketplace of ideas where truth eventually rises to the top. But AI floods the market with counterfeit currency. If I can use AI to generate a fake video of you saying something heinous, and the social mob cancels you before the truth even gets its boots on, what good is your First Amendment right? The No Political Enemies Act doesn't help you there because it wasn't the government that did it. It was a bot farm or a troll.
But that's exactly why we need more speech tools, not restrictions. The remedy for deepfakes is authentication technologies like the C2PA standard that verify the origin of content. We need to be able to prove what is real.
And who controls the authentication? Who decides what gets the verified checkmark?
It's decentralized. But my point is, if we start regulating algorithms to protect people from disinformation or social backlash, we're inviting the government back in to decide what is true. And that brings us right back to the tyranny of the Ministry of Truth. I would rather deal with the messiness of a free, chaotic, AI-driven marketplace than have a government bureaucrat smoothing out the edges.
That is a principled stance, but it ignores the collateral damage. You're asking the average citizen to be a warrior in an information hellscape. The 65% statistic, the fear of speaking, is driven by this unpredictability. You might be targeted by a bot farm, or a coordinated activist campaign, or just a misunderstood clip taken out of context by an AI. The fear of being targeted outweighs the comfort of potential legal vindication.
The middle has to toughen up. That sounds harsh, but liberty is not for the thin-skinned. We're in a transition period, yes. But the answer is not to ask the government to make us feel safe. The answer is to use the tools like the No Political Enemies Act to punish actual government abuse. And for the rest, we rely on cultural resilience.
Resilience is easy to preach when you aren't the one being targeted.
But look at the alternative. If we validate the chilling effect as a reason for the government to intervene in private speech, who do we empower? The state. And history tells us that is always the greater danger. I'll take the mob over the secret police any day, because the mob eventually loses interest. The secret police do not.
Or perhaps the environment has just become too toxic for human habitation, and we're seeing a retreat into private spheres.
The public square is becoming a ghost town because the snipers, both human and algorithmic, are on the roofs. And a ghost town isn't a democracy.
I think this brings us to a natural point of synthesis, because we really illuminated the core friction. From my perspective, looking at the landscape of 2026, the structural integrity of the First Amendment is sound. We have the Villa ruling preventing backdoor censorship. We have the No Political Enemies Act imposing financial costs on government overreach. We have courts striking down DHS targeting of students. The system is self-repairing. What you call a chilling effect, I call the noise of a free society. We must not confuse social discomfort with censorship. We should encourage thicker skin, not weaker laws.
And I maintain that a society where people are legally free to speak but socially terrified to do so is not truly free. The data is clear. 65% of Americans are scared. The partisan divide on what constitutes accountability versus punishment indicates a fracturing of the social contract that the law cannot heal. If we don't address the culture of disruptive tactics, the self-censorship, and the weaponization of tech, the First Amendment will become a hollow shield, a museum piece that we admire while we all keep our mouths shut.
It is a debate that I suspect will continue well beyond 2026. The tension between freedom and comfort is, well, it's eternal.
Undoubtedly, as long as people disagree, the friction will be there.
Thank you for the rigorous exchange.
Always a pleasure.
And to our listeners, we encourage you to examine the material, look at the laws, look at your own social circles, and determine if you feel free to speak your own mind. Welcome to the debate.